basically going to present information from Iceland, the three of us. I'll start, then Rannveig will come, and then Rebecca. And we will sort of be focusing on Iceland in a fairly broad way and tell you about what we've been doing. So this is just to illustrate again the people that are associated with the workshop and are associated with the project, but there are many more people, and I urge you to look at the BIODICE website to get full information about the project. But I just wanted to start by sort of a little bit where Catherine was located and really emphasize that the biodiversity crisis or biodiversity loss is really a global emergency. And we all agree that these four main aspects that are listed there are really responsible for this. And habitat destruction was, of course, highly mentioned a lot here in Catherine's talk. And interestingly, we are often not considering these together. So this report, which also has this interesting name, Making Peace with Nature, is a 2021 report from the Environmental Organization of the United Nations, is really taking this kind of philosophical, social aspect further, as was also emphasized very much by Catherine. We need to make peace with nature because we have been at war with nature. And then just to emphasize also that we do have a lot of good work from the United Nations and also from the other international organizations, both working on biodiversity loss and climate change. So these are just recent reports. And just to continue with this sort of big picture, yet another slide here, is that the message that people are really giving now, in part because prior plans to work with biodiversity targets, like from the Aichi goals in 2010, have largely failed. And we see the same thing with the sustainability goals of the United Nations. That we are really saying that now we need to stop transforming nature and start transforming our relationship with nature. And because we're talking about the targets, and Tanaka already showed you the overall picture, this is one of the targets, the one on the bottom there. This is for the 250 target. It is really saying that humanity needs to live in harmony with nature, which is a very, very tall order, of course. But this is the way these discussions are going, so we're dealing with extremely serious issues. Okay, so we have this project funded by the Nordic Working Group for Biodiversity, which is a part of the Nordic Council of Ministers, and they provided us with funding for this year, and Denmark, Iceland, and Finland are working together. And that's the part of this workshop is a part of that project. So our primary aim is really to facilitate, help the Nordic sector to implement the biodiversity targets that were accepted in Montreal in 2022. Simple as that, We'll dive into this. And we've actually made very nice contact with several other projects in the Nordic sector on this. And but the sub-aims for this particular year is really only to evaluate the status of implementation of the targets. And then next year we will continue with diving more formally into this if we continue to get funding. So, and we do also limit ourselves to targets 1 to 8 and 21, but with direct reference to many other targets that have been listed, as you will notice in this meeting. So just to give you a little bit of an orientation of how we do this, we are kind of working with this matrix where we put up list of the targets, and then we look into the way people approach in the first column there, and then look at action plans. We look at where things have actually been, progress has been made, and then list what problems there are. And this is, we're trying to do this at a fairly comprehensive level. And then, at the end of the day, in our final report, which will be written in December, we will make a comparison among the countries. And maybe this is the most important thing, is to learn from the comparison we do between countries. And this has been actually very rarely done. So that is our project in a nutshell, and you will learn more about it during this workshop. But I want to switch a little bit and momentarily tell you a little bit about biodiversity in Iceland, just introduce Iceland a little bit. But first, we want to emphasize this definition of biodiversity, because it is a key. It's this Convention of Biological Diversity's definition, which is very important for the implementation using ecosystem approach for implementing the targets. It's actually a key that the concept is not only emphasizing species numbers, it's emphasizing within species diversity, and maybe most importantly, ecosystem diversity. Because biodiversity is the foundation of any living systems, ecosystems included. It's the source of choices for any kind of resilient responses of systems like ecosystems to changes like climate change, as an example. And just to remind us of what Catherine, of course, emphasized here, is that ecosystems are the foundation of life on Earth. And we, as humans, step into that picture with our effects. And that relates to the concept of ecosystem approach, which we will not have time to dive into the details of this, but that is really the methodology that the CBD is recommending for implementing biodiversity targets. So a little bit about Iceland, just like a little natural history, which relates to how we work with biodiversity and has a very strong influence, is that Iceland, of course, is geologically isolated, volcanic and tectonic island in the middle of the North Atlantic. And it's very isolated, and it's also only 10,000 years since the glacier left, and it was really tabula rasa for life there. So very few species have been able to colonize in Iceland since then. We're looking at something like between 5 and 10% of the fauna and flora of Scandinavia, for example, which is in Iceland, just to give you an idea. But Iceland offers highly diverse habitats because of its volcanic and tectonic nature, and also because these very clear boundaries that we have between glaciers, oceans, and terrestrial environments. So what we have witnessed is a major evolutionary process, just like Darwin saw in Galapagos, really. And I'm actually an evolutionary biologist in the basis, so that's what I study. And so we've seen very rapid processes. So when we talk about drivers and processes, like Catherine was talking about, we need to take this process also into account, like the process of diversification. And just to give you a little illustration of what I'm talking about, this is just a few organisms that have been studied in details for special local evolution in Iceland. And you see this cuts across the fauna and flora, really. And so here we are seeing like special adaptations. Obviously not going to be able to go into any details of that. But maybe more importantly, we also see examples of diversifying evolution, where we have up in the corner the Arctic char that had diversified very strongly into occupying different diets and habitats in freshwater lakes in Iceland. And that's actually been studied a lot in northern Scandinavia also. And then we have the Arctic fox diversifying into two morphs. There is no red fox in Iceland, so the brown fox really goes into the red fox niche. And I could go on about this. The other examples are clear. Maybe the most important one there being the Atlantic cod, which comes in offshore and inshore populations. And also we see this in invertebrates. So this is just to give you a little insight into the biology of and the ecology of what we are up against in our research and our sort of studies of biodiversity in Iceland, also related to the implementation of the targets. So I will give Rannveig now the word to move on and tell you more about the details of what we do.
Thank you, Skúli. I'm switching gears a little bit, but still continuing a little bit with what Skúli was saying. We have two projects in Iceland at the moment, and one is with the Ministry of Food, Fisheries and Agriculture, and this has been done in 2024. And we've carried this out in parallel with the Nordic Biodiversity Framework, like our Nordic project. So we are looking at the subjects of the ministry, which are agriculture, fisheries, aquaculture, which is very highly flammable in Iceland, land reclamation and forestry. And we are evaluating the implementation status in relation to all the targets. So we're diving really deep in this project. And it's way more detailed than we are doing with a Nordic comparison. And we are hoping to work with other ministries with this. And the work is twofold. First, they just went into, our colleague went into existing policy and evaluated that. And that's mostly done. But now we are going in detail with professionals at the ministry and the ministry's agencies. And that's an ongoing project, and it's just started last week. So it's we're very interested what comes out of that work. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about the workshop we had in Iceland this spring, 23rd of April. We had 40 attendants from a really wide part of our ministries, and we had top people coming to the. We are very proud that we accomplished this, to get all these people in the same room. We had representatives from 9 ministries out of 12, which we think was really good. 10 governmental agencies. We had 3 people from the Icelandic Association of Local Authorities, which are the municipalities. We had 2 universities and 2 NGOs, all stuck together in one room for a whole day. This was we were very happy. And it was a twofold workshop. First, we had presentations on biodiversity matters in the biodiversity plan. In Iceland, Denmark, and Finland, here you can see our lovely Catherine Richardson having also an inspirational talk like she had earlier today. And Hanna-Kaisa had also a really good talk about the Finnish situation. And then in the afternoon, we had group discussions, 4 groups working on 3 sets of questions. And the aim of the group discussions and the whole workshop was more or less just to connect people across the administration. We were, this had not happened before, and people were very pleased with just getting the chance of sitting together in a locked room, discussing these matters and coming to some conclusion. But then, of course, the second aim was to share information. And we talked about how biodiversity appears in Icelandic administration. We were trying to map projects, current project and future project. We were trying to describe, or they were trying to describe obstacles and successes on biodiversity projects. And we were looking at cooperation across ministries, agencies, and others. Like I said, we had 4 groups, and we had transcripts from the groups talking about, with everything that they talked about in those 3 hours. And then I got the transcript from each group, did a qualitative thematic analysis, which is very challenging for the biologist. But I basically just cut it all down and regrouped and tried to get all the main points out of it. And then, last but not least, we had everyone, all the participants had a chance to read it, and they all gave comments. And there was surprisingly much agreement. Everyone said, I mean, I had minor changes that I made, but everyone was like, yes, this is grasping my feeling of the workshop. And like I said, these are the top people in the ministries and the governmental agencies, and they are speaking with the ministers. So we are very pleased that they had enjoyed it and had got good information from this workshop. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the results from that discussions. So first, about understanding biodiversity, and Skúli did mention a little bit about biodiversity, which is the subject we're here to talk about. And people agree that within places where there are experts in life sciences, in the ministries and the governmental agencies, the understanding is quite good. There are biologists or natural scientists working there. But in general, most general, they are not having great understanding. Either there's little interest, and then this workshop sparked interest, so that's a really good thing. So little interest or basic misconceptions. So not thinking even that adding species to an ecosystem is adding to the biodiversity. And I don't know if you have this problem here in Finland, but this is a huge problem in Iceland, where they think that counting species is what biodiversity is. So adding a lupine that is invasive is increasing biodiversity, while we all know here that it's a decreasing biodiversity. And another thing that was very surprising, or not surprising, but quite striking, was that there's very little understanding with local authorities. And they are doing much of the planning work. They are working on target 1, which is, in some opinions, might be one of the main targets to spatial plan and to plan with no loss of biodiversity. So this was a bit of a shock to see that there was very little understanding with the local authorities or the municipalities. We were also linking biodiversity to other issues, and here there are top two that people talked about. Public health and epidemic preventions, like COVID-19 really shook everything up and put biodiversity a little bit on the map for some people. And then, of course, climate change. And everyone agreed that we need a greater link between biodiversity and climate change. And we need to make sure that these climate actions don't negatively affect biodiversity. And there are two examples in Iceland where that could happen, is that we are building carbon forests using foreign species that are possibly invasive. And also we are building planning to build a lot of windmills that could harm wildlife and have very negative effects in some cases. And then we were discussing administration and laws. This connects to Target 14, where we need to integrate biodiversity in decision-making on every level. And people realized that there were lots of hindrances when it comes to law. In Iceland, we have weak laws, we have lack of regulations, we have lack of enforcement and lack of consequences. So even if the law is there stating like, oh, all is good, we're protecting this, there's like always like accept. So they are very weak laws, what we have. So that's a huge hindrance. And also people continuously talked about silos, like there's little collaboration between ministries and governmental agencies. So you have a silo here, they're only talking amongst themselves, and then another silo here, and they're not speaking, they're not getting the experts from the universities to have opinions and talking across these silos. So that was a continuous talk about that. And also lack of funding, priority, and accountability. Suggestions all rhyme with Target 14. We need to make biodiversity an immediate priority and integrate into all administration. And we need to fund action plans and projects. So it sounds very simple, but that's our goal. Also, with the spatial planning, with Target 1, which deals with plan and management of areas to reduce or like close to zero biodiversity loss. The hindrances there were that people with little understanding of biodiversity and even misconceptions about biodiversity, they are the ones taking the major decisions. And this kind of overlaps with Target 21 with information and data. So that's a very serious problem that we have. And someone, as a direct quote here, someone said, it's not easy to say no to your neighbors. And if you're living in a very small community, then this is happening everywhere. Like someone suggests something and you're like, oh yeah, it sounds like a great idea, and well, let's just do it. But with no idea about biodiversity, this can be very dangerous and negative for biodiversity. So suggestions were like, of course, rhyming with Target 1. All planning must take biodiversity into account. Tackle these issues together, biodiversity and climate, and last but not least, is include stakeholders to build trust. And the stakeholder part is a really big part of the ecosystem approach that Skúli mentioned earlier, that we could have a whole workshop about. But that's to build trust, yes. Data information and knowledge, lack of data, and it's a huge problem and hindrance when working with biodiversity. And we are also lacking material for students and the public. Suggestions are, and this is all to do with Target 21, is that knowledge needs to be made available and accessible to everyone, like we know. And education is a key element to the biodiversity plan. And I've worked prior with schools and kids, and this is an increasingly important stuff to have. We need to put this in the curriculum, we need to put this into study material, and also to be available for people, like, yeah. Oh, someone saw a ghost there. And also, us scientists, we are not professionals in marketing. Like we're not great at that. Not all of us. So let's use professionals. Let's use people who have studied how to make it fun and available, and use humor and use all these fun things that you can do, little animations, and science communicators. Like let's use these people who know how to do this. We can fact check afterwards, but we might not be the best experts to do this. And Becca is going to take over She's going to tell you a little bit about indicators, but also her really cool projects about how to make things fun for kids and people. Thank you.
Yeah. So this summer I've been working through the biodiversity plan, trying to break it down and make it easier to understand. Also digging into the targets and indicators to pick out what they're even asking for, hopefully making them easier to know what actually needs to be done. So I wanted to share a bit of this process with you and give an example based on my own research. So first of all, the structure of the plan, I'm just going to go over that really quickly. It's broken down into 4 general goals. And then these are outcomes to be aimed for by 2050. And then each of these goals are further broken down into 23 action-oriented targets. And these are to be fulfilled by 2030, or at least most of them. And then each target has 1 or more indicators to give a specific way to measure that target. So if we take target 1 as an example, target 1 has to do with spatial planning, like we were talking about earlier. It has 4 required indicators. The first 3 are called headline indicators, and these give a quantitative measure and to report on. The last one is called a binary indicator, which is more or less a yes or no answer. Is this country doing this? Yes or no. Some of them will have more of a scale to account for progress, but most of them are just yes or no. And then the required indicators don't necessarily cover everything in the target. So that's where the component and complementary indicators come in. And these are optional to report on, but they're designed for the countries to choose what is most useful to them to report on their context. The component indicators are meant to fill in the gaps that the headline and binary indicators don't fill in the target, and the complementary indicators are meant to dive deeper into one subject. And even though these are optional to report on, from what I've seen, they're going to be necessary if biodiversity is going to be a priority for all of these targets. So these are some screenshots from a big spreadsheet that I've been building this summer, trying to organize the information from the CBD website. So I don't have a lot of time to get into the details, but I wanted to give an overview of what I've been doing. So I broke down each target into the main goal and importance, and then into the different elements that make up the target. And then I tried to match the indicators to the elements to see how well they covered the targets, to see if there was any gaps that could be covered by the optional indicators. And then I dove further into the indicators themselves, taking the information from the metadata on the website. And this is a lot of information. It's a bit overwhelming. So I tried to pull out the details, what would be most helpful to us in getting started in particular. And some of the indicator methods are completely available, while others are still in development. So this is information that's constantly being updated, and I think especially after this COP16 this month, there will be a lot more information on these. So I did this for the optional indicators as well, broke down the important information, and then I tried to recommend some of them that would be useful to fill the target gaps for, especially for Iceland. And if anybody has more questions about this or is just interested, you can talk to me later. We'll hopefully have a version of this spreadsheet to share with everybody who's interested. So now I'm going to get a bit more specific and talk about my research with green spaces. And we'll take target 12 as an example, which is enhancing green spaces and urban planning. And there are 3 elements listed for this target for human well-being, for biodiversity, green and blue spaces with biodiversity-inclusive urban planning, and mainstreaming, which is incorporating biodiversity into policies and practices. And this is, that last element is basically target 14, so you can already see how these are overlapping. And these, sorry. And it comes with 2 headline and binary indicators. The first one is a headline indicator that has to do with the percentage of a city that is public green space or blue space. And the second one is a binary indicator whether the country is planning has urban planning and green spaces or blue spaces. And these, even with the optional indicators, they don't necessarily cover all these elements fully. So this is one reason why it's important for national and local plans to prioritize biodiversity as well. So outside of this work, like I said before, my research has centered mostly around urban biodiversity in Reykjavik. And this is Reykjavik here, focusing mostly on bird diversity. And bird diversity can be a good overall indicator of how biodiversity is doing as a whole, and can show trends across the city based on attributes of a green space like size or location. And the trends that I was finding so far has been different for Reykjavik than other European cities. The green space parks downtown had more bird species than in the suburbs, which is actually the opposite trend that is found in most cities around the world. So that raises a lot of questions. Like when spatial planning for urban spaces, what kind of biodiversity are we planning for? What is the understanding of biodiversity behind that? And what is the priority? As Skúli was saying earlier, biodiversity is not only about the number of species, it's about the abundance and which species are there. It's about native species, and this is especially important for plants as well. In urban parks and in gardens, it's common to plant alien species, and those can escape and spread, and this is happening in Reykjavik, where some of these plants are becoming invasive. So this is definitely one of those situations where adding species isn't necessarily increasing biodiversity. So it's an example of how urbanization is changing natural communities. And so these are all important things to consider when creating plans and goals for Target 12. And that's why education is so important, especially for policymakers and the general public. Green spaces have been a great point of connection between nature and people in my work. Everybody who lives in Reykjavik knows a green space, even if they don't realize they do. They walk through it on the way to the bus or drive past it on the way to work. So it's very familiar to people. In my most recent work has been developing this fake travel website for birds to review green spaces. So I call it Wingfluencer. And it's been a really fun project for me. So these 3 points have become my toolbox, basically, in this project. To make it accessible, it needs to be easy to understand and approachable both visually and in language. So I have this available in both English and Icelandic. Creativity can draw attention and interest and has the power to inspire people. And humor breaks down barriers and makes information more fun. So just as a quick example, it's very common in Reykjavik to see geese just on the side of the road in the smallest patch of grass. So I made this goose character who kind of just trolls all of the posts to talk about grass. So it's just these little things that can make it more fun. And to finish up, I just wanted to point out again the overlap of the targets. Just this one topic of green spaces not only connects to Target 12, but also to all of these and more. Especially wanted to highlight Target 21 again, where green spaces act as people's connection point to nature and can act as a launching pad for education about biodiversity. And I will hand it back to Skúli just to wrap things up.
Yeah, we just have one final slide to tell you about the next steps of our project, which of course this workshop is clearly a part of. So the most important part of the work, sort of from now on, after the workshop, will be to do the comparison. And the results from the upcoming COP16 meeting, as Becca indicated, that is now starting in Colombia in a week or so, or 2 weeks, is very important. So we will be able to incorporate that into our final report, and so which will be written as a consequence of this. And then we will have a concluding workshop on the 10th and 11th in Copenhagen, in Denmark, where we hope to be able to present at least preliminary results and create a little bit of a media discussion also about the sort of basic findings of the project. And then we hope to be able to continue the work in 25 and 26. And the exciting thing about 25 then is to actually create a leading practice, which of course will build a lot on this indicator work that Becca has started. So, and then in 2026, we aim to have a very comprehensive international conference about biodiversity, focusing on our results of our project, but also invite people, and that conference is meant to be in Iceland. So that concludes our presentation. Thank you very much.